1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Gwyn Olsen, senior winemaker at Henschke in the Barossa. I only met Gwyn a couple of years ago while judging at the Australian Alternative Varieties wine show, not long after making the acquaintance of her almost equally impressive partner, Adam Walls of Wine Selectors, who plays an important cameo in this conversation. Gwyn and I talked about French deception and a baptism of fire in the Languedoc, playing on when you don't fit in at school, scoring success to season a cold-served dish of revenge, ferment flash flooding and quick thinking clear-ups as a cellarat, how to be yourself, or how much of yourself to be, in a high-stakes job interview, cosmic coincidence in the family almanac, the roadblocks littering a woman's wine industry career path, Super Sangiovese, silly jokes and solidarity in Sydney, and who chooses what to drink in a household of prized palates. I started by asking Gwyn where on earth it all started.
I was born in Cairns, far north Queensland, from a long line of banana benders and cane growers. And when I was 4, my dad accepted a job in Indonesia, in what was at the time Irian Jaya, then became West Papua, in a copper and gold mine. He was a surveyor and my mum a school teacher. So dad and mum, with their adventurous spirit, packed up their 3 kids. I'm the middle child, and moved their 3 kids at the ages of 6, 4 and 2 to the backwater of Indonesia on the hunt of a better job and a better lifestyle than they currently had in Cairns.
Right.
I had my primary school there. It was one of those very idyllic childhoods of building dams in creeks, having to be home at 5 p.m. because that's when dad came home from work. And, you know, weekends were down at the river with all the other families, inner tubing, and the dads putting up flying foxes. It was a very adventurous childhood, a lot of activity and a lot of nature and a lot of freedom to run around and to try new things, which was a lot of fun.
Okay. Nationality-wise, how did you fit in?
Well, we moved over there when I was 4, so born and bred Australian. It was certainly an adventure for us. It's predominantly American mining town. We were one of the very few Australian families, so we were quite the oddity there. My sister, we moved over when she was 2, so she actually still speaks with a slight American twang. But it was, you know, quite a mix of culture. So you had the Indonesian kids, you had the indigenous Papuan kids, you had the mining town kids, and perception from child, quite a thriving metropolis of many different cultures meeting together to all have a good time and learn a lot about each other and have a lot of fun. Of course, you know, as you get older and you hear more about probably the adult side of it was probably a bit different. But from a child's perspective, it was a very idyllic, multicultural, fun, inclusive way to grow up.
How long did you spend there?
I was there from 4 until 12 when I went to boarding school in Brisbane. My parents were there for 30 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So was it easy to fit in after that, you know, really wildly different, I would have thought, from a lot of your classmates' upbringing in Indonesia?
Yeah. Look, boarding school for me was not an entirely positive experience. I couldn't say that I was the quintessential private girls boarding school personality type. Found it really hard to make friends. Had a fair amount of bullying and things like that in the early years, which was very hard and was certainly not something that I remember fondly. But certainly the opportunity in the older grades, you know, grade 10, 11, 12 that you got to in Queensland, certainly allowed that, being at a private girls' boarding school. There was a lot of opportunities there that we wouldn't have had ordinarily at other areas. And obviously with mum and dad choosing to maintain their international jobs to put the family in a position that they wanted, it was one of those decisions that we all made and all became used to. But I remember the later years a lot more fondly than the earlier years, and I certainly won't be sending my children to boarding school anytime soon.
And so what were your areas of solace or escape in those years?
Oh, absolutely sport. So, one of the great things about being a boarder is you can get involved into every single thing. And I was track and field, cross country, soccer. I took up artistic gymnastics, attempted swimming. It was one of those things that, right, well, if I can escape these four walls of this boarding house, then it will be up at 5 a.m. for running, or into gymnastics from 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning until 12 p.m. I think, I'm a naturally quite energetic person anyway. I have a very large personality, and I think it was also one of those things that just sort of wove in quite nicely there in terms of being able to have this outlet of frustration. And I think that's probably one of the difficult things about young women. I don't know if young men are the same, seeing as I've never been one. But, it's always funny that they might not be your friend in the boarding house, but they're your best friend in your gymnastics squad, or they're the person you spend running with. And it was quite interesting learning how to navigate those relationships and learning how to really navigate, oh, you don't like me in this space because clearly other people don't like me, but you seem to like me when it's just me and you together, kind of thing. And I think you really learn a lot about people at boarding school. Yep. And about relationships.
Were you a bright child, or were you able to express your brightness at school?
I was a challenging child that found school easy but liked to ask a lot of questions. So yes, I enjoyed it, but also the regiment of everything having to have a set answer and things like that was, again, probably another boundary that I struggled with. But we got there in the end, and I ended up as school prefect and finished high school with quite good marks, and got my overall position, as was all the rage in Queensland when I finished school and did that sort of thing. So I naturally was quite interested in the sciences, and I was very fortunate to have a number of very passionate science teachers at school, whether they be biology or chemistry and things like that. Wonderful people who really obviously enjoyed teaching those subjects. I think that's really where that fascination of science and how things worked and how things could be made and everything really started to foster from there.
Right. And so with a very short part of your life then in Queensland, then off overseas to a really quite exotic upbringing there, and then to boarding school, how settled were you at the end of that on the idea of being in a specific place? Were you ready to be uprooted again? Did you want to go further afield?
I suppose it probably speaks exactly to how the next steps were, and the next steps were that I was offered places in Queensland for university, but none of them really felt like it was something I wanted to do. And I was having a chat to mum and dad about a gap year or what I was going to do. And I sort of remember dad saying, well, I think if you have a gap year, you'll probably never get to university. So I ended up applying to direct entry at the University of Otago in Dunedin on the South Island of New Zealand, having a couple family holidays in Queenstown and whatever, thought that might be a bit of fun to get down there in that beautiful part of the world and a very prestigious university. So signed up for that and got in to what was health sciences first year, which is sort of their main kind of entry feed into all of the med, pharmacy, physio, med lab, sci, all that sort of stuff. And it was a very large cohort in that first year, and then it filters out into all those streams. And it's a lot of chemistry, biology, genetics and all that kind of thing, and had a lot of fun doing that. But it's funny, my dad had this idea that I should become a doctor. Now, I'm not suggesting I have the mental capacity to be a doctor, but he thought that I should become a doctor. So when I was home from boarding school in one of the school holidays when we were still living in Indonesia, he had managed one of his surgeon friends to kind of convince me to let me watch the day's surgery at the hospital. So like fully scrubbed in, like standing next to this person being operated on, and I remember sweating so profusely and just watching all this, and I sort of came out there very set on quite clearly medicine would not be for me.
Right. That's that one crossed off the list.
Absolutely. So, I sort of fell into biochemistry at the University of Otago. It was a lot of fun. I mean, if you've never been to Dunedin, it's what they call a scarfy town. You know, the University of Otago is a big thing there and a lot of students live there, and it's such a wonderful culture of just student life and the rich history of the University of Otago there. But eventually sort of fell into biochemistry because enzymes are fascinating and other things in biochemistry are fascinating, and got to my final year and sort of realised that not really too sure what the job prospects would be like in biochem, and having a chat to my favourite professor there, who was Dr. Kevin Reardon at the time. He went on to be the Dean of Science there. He actually sort of said, oh, well, you've got all these things, what about like winemaking or brewing or something like that? And he had studied at the University of Adelaide, so he wrote a reference letter for me to get into the University of Adelaide postgraduate oenology. So I went straight from completing my Bachelor of Science undergrad in biochemistry into the postgrad diploma of oenology, and I was the only person in my postgrad year that had never ever stepped foot in a winery before.
Right. What about wine? Was that part of your life, or was it kind of just a bit weird to be in it?
Mum and Dad really, really enjoy the conviviality of eating and drinking. Dad has always actively bought wine and collected wine, and both of them very much enjoy food and see food as such a wonderful way to, spread stories and share love and things like that. So I think it wasn't so much wine specifically, but it was the thought of what wine and food culture can do and what fun times and what memories and things like that wine and food together can evoke and to create.
Yeah, and from Dunedin, where I guess your sporty side in that very outdoorsy and energetic nation of New Zealand was probably really well fed. Did you find when you got to Adelaide that you felt that you were around like-minded people in this new course?
Yes and no. I mean, for sure, everyone there was really, really keen to get into wine and have a great time and everything, and met some really wonderful people in the postgrad course and really enjoyed it. And I think there was such an energy of vibrancy about getting into... I mean, this was 2004, 2005, so quite an energy about the wine industry and where we could go and what we're going to create and all sorts of things like that. So, yeah, it was a lovely bunch of people.
Who was in your cohort?
In my postgrad cohort, a lot of international students, so a lot of people now in, the likes of America and Europe and things like that. So I don't know if you know Cherie Spriggs and Brad Graytrix. So yep. They're the winemakers at Nye Timber in the UK. Nina Stocker and Kate Day, so they're in Victoria. So Nina Stocker's family runs Brave Goose, and Kate's now consulting winemaking outside of Mudgee, I think she is. Andre Bondar of Bondar, Shane Holloway, who's down in Delamere with his wife Fran, Dave Feldheim, who is down with his lovely wife Cynthia in Tassie as well. So yeah, a lot of characters who are in the wine industry still, which is really nice.
Yeah, cool. And what work experience / internship opportunities arose while you were there?
I did postgrad, so it was 1 year. So it was really, really funny. It was kind of quite a defining moment of, I suppose, where my career would perhaps start out. Halfway through the year, sort of realised that everyone else has had experience in other wineries and had probably jobs to go to and things like that. And I remember it kind of dawning on me in maybe February, March, that because it's an intensive postgrad, you don't really do vintage in that 1 year course. And I remember thinking, I'm going to finish in June and I've never stepped foot in a winery before in my life. Who in their right mind is going to hire a winemaker in the middle of winter with no practical experience at all? And I was looking at the university notice board and there was this notice for a internship in the south of France, in Vias, just outside of Béziers in the Languedoc. And it sort of said, prerequisite, pretty much nothing. You just have to be willing to travel. You have to stay there 6 months and you have to speak French. So, okay, no worries. I mean, one small problem, can't speak a word of French.
All right.
So I took my CV and my cover letter and I put them into auto-translate on the web. And again, this is 2005, so certainly no AI, and the auto-translate must have been slightly dodgy.
Probably basic, but at the same time, I like the problem solving that's going on here.
So I sent it over to the winery and they hired me.
And how was that?
I remember I got to the winery in the south of France and the very lovely winemaker Sebastian, he comes over and he starts talking to me in his very lovely French, and this kind of look just washed over my face. And then he stood there and he looked at me and in perfect English he said, "You don't speak a word of French, do you?" And I said, "No, but I'm a really quick learner." And he said, "All right, well, first month you can learn French because our one cellar hand at this winery does not speak a word of English."
Right.
And he said, "Second month I will speak to you in only French. You can respond in English if you have to, but by the third month in this winery, there will be no English." And I thought, oh, okay. So I learnt very rustic south of France winery French very quickly and had a wonderful time. It was one of those moments that I think you really do realise just how fantastic this industry is in terms of shared knowledge and shared culture and a lot of hard work and a lot of fun at the same time. So Sebastian, he went over and above in terms of teaching me things, from barrel tastings and forest selection to, the local food and wine culture there and all sorts of different things. And Jean-Claude, the local cellar hand there, has never travelled anywhere before. He was such a great help in terms of like history of France and trying to have broken French conversations about these sort of things. And it's even just really basic memories. Like I remember having lunch with Sebastian and his family one day, and he pulled out a bottle of Tissot. And he's like, this is one of France's great icons of a wine, and it takes a lot of time to understand these sorts of wines. And you have to drink it with Comté cheese. But I want you to experience the other side of French winemaking and the other things that we do. And you can't drink it fast. You went through all the subtle nuances of it and all the different layers and look at it alone and then look at it with the cheese and all that sort of thing. And I really just remember thinking, wow, the cut and thrust of it is amazing. But again, also this eating and drinking side of it is amazing as well. And I just thought, yeah, this is great.
Has Tissot remained a fond part of your life because of that detailed way that you came across it?
It's such a beautiful thing, right? Like it's such a complex, fascinating style of wine that changes, and you can sit there and look at it and it's deeply savoury and so many delicious aspects to it. So yes, I do still buy it and enjoy drinking it as well.
And so I guess as well, you had your hands in quite a lot of different phases of the winemaking process, got to see a lot really quickly and a fast learning experience right the way through, not just with the language, but with the actual tasks that you had to tick off down there.
Oh, absolutely. Like everything from waxing 20,000 litre square tanks to digging out things to working out how filters work, working out how all these sorts of strange pumps work and pumping over and dealing with the irate growers that are upset that they're dropping off things and you're not ready for them and things like that. So yeah, it was a baptism of fire, but it was facilitated by very lovely people who were so passionate about not what they did, but also teaching and their way of life and the shared industry. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about it.
How long were you in the Languedoc?
6 months there until Christmas, actually. And then, saw a bit of snow and came home.
Home to where?
So then I moved back to New Zealand and got a job at Villa Maria in Auckland as one of their entry-level grade 3 cellar hands on my really generous New Zealand dollar salary of $36,000 a year, no super, and started out as a cellar hand there. A lot of really interesting moving parts in that business and a lot of good opportunity there.
So you were presumably making quite a few contacts, getting to know quite a lot of the New Zealand areas, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Villa Maria in 2005 and was there until 2011. So it was just on the sort of precipice of growth of Villa. So they had their old original site at K Road when I first joined, and they'd just built their sort of state-of-the-art purpose facility in Mangere in Auckland and moved it in there. And it was fascinating to look at all the different technology that at the time that they'd put in, and such a slick operation in terms of how they'd gone about engineering the winery. And it was before they'd built their Marlborough winery and before they'd built any sort of expansion down into the gimlet gravels and things. So we got everything from Ihumātao Chardonnay at the Auckland winery right through to Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, Marlborough Pinot Noir, Hawke's Bay, Gimlet Gravels, Syrah, Merlot, a little bit of Cabernet, Gisborne Chardonnay and all that sort of thing. So it was a very diverse and very wonderful learning space that, from a cellar hand, you can really sink your teeth into things, and you learn a lot by doing things right, but you also learn a lot by doing things wrong. And it was always a bit of that to really sort of work out, how things go and everything. I remember one of my most frustrating things as a cellar hand, and I know that it frustrates cellar hands the world over, is that when you have a multiple team of winemakers, every winemaker has an opinion of how they want a particular job done, and then they tell that to the cellar supervisor or the cellar manager, and then they foster out the work, right? And so there was a 120,000 litre Sauvignon Blanc tank that had stratified in ferment, so the top was fermenting and the bottom was not, and so the winemaking team wanted the tank mixed. The cellar supervisor had decided that we should use a submersible pump for that, so they sent the green cellar hand up to the top to pop the subby in. And basically, when yeast ferments sugar into alcohol, the two main byproducts are carbon dioxide and heat. And if it's stratified, so you've got high concentration of sugar, low temperature at the bottom, low concentration of sugar, high temperature at the top, and you aim to mix it so that all of that ferment gets homogeneous. But the problem with doing that is that it causes what we call a ferment flash, where all of a sudden the yeast go a bit crazy and all the carbon dioxide gets released. So I put one subby in and I flicked it on really quick and then flipped it off again, and that didn't do anything. So then I flicked it on, didn't do anything. So the cellar supervisor says to me, put another subby in there. So I went up, grabbed another subby, chucked it in there. I flicked it on for a millisecond, flicked it off, and I vividly remember it because the turret is like 1/2 metre tall, and all of a sudden I heard this whooshing sound and it just went and the whole thing just started rocketing up the top, and I just looked at it and it's like hitting the roof on this top of a 120,000 litre ferment. You know, the difference between a great cellar hand and an okay cellar hand is not actually how great they are at doing good work. It's what they do in that moment that things are going badly. So I was like, oh my God, you know, there's no point screwing down the lid if you've never seen one of these things. So, you know, I'm hooning it down the stairs, I'm grabbing a hose, the 120k next door to it was empty, so dooring it up, opening the hose and just sort of, you know, trying to flick it in there on gravity sort of thing. So, of course, no one's helping because everyone's just in stitches of laughter. But I think I only ended up losing 1,000 litres, so it always looks like so much more than it is. But just certainly one of those core defining memories, I think.
Yeah, it's good to hear that they were also supportive of you in that task you were assigned. And so over that 6 years at Villa, how did your responsibility and role evolve?
I've only ever worked for privately family-owned companies, and Villa was quite good at training in-house and promoting in-house. So moved up from cellar hand level C to B to A, eventually cellar supervisor, and then had the opportunity. They decided they were going to create an assistant winemaker role. They actually advertised externally and internally for the role, so went through the whole application process, interview and all that sort of thing, and was successful in that, which was wonderful. So, you know, classic assistant winemaker role. You're the night winemaker on vintage for 3 months as the sole winemaker, which means you really get to sink your teeth in and work out a few lessons for yourself, because, you know, there's nothing worse than having to call the head winemaker at 2:30 in the morning to ask them a question or to tell them that you've done something wrong. Thankfully, I only had to do that once. Then from there was promoted up to operations winemaker. And once I got up to operations winemaker, you know, you're facilitating all the bottling of all the wines, you're, you know, finishing wines, you're looking after all day-to-day operations of the winery. So I was tasked with, you know, workflow, managing the shifts, all of that kind of stuff, which was a really, really interesting and rewarding job. But kind of got to the point after 1.5 2 years of doing it that I sort of realised like all of the winemakers above me were actually not that much older than me, sort of 5-10 years sort of thing, and they were all quite comfortable in their roles and quite cemented in their place. So I sort of realised that there was no room to move from a winemaking career progression point of view, and all my family back in Australia sort of made the decision, right, well, maybe it's time for me to move back to the mainland and sink my teeth into the Australian industry and learn a bit more over there. So ended up contacting one of my first great bosses and great mentors. Corey Ryan was the chief winemaker at Villa Maria when I was hired as assistant winemaker and operations winemaker. He then moved to McWilliams. So I contacted him and said, you know, I'm looking to move back to Australia. I'm looking for a winemaking role. Can I use you as a reference if you hear of anything, blah, 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 blah. And he came back to me a week later and he said, oh, actually, there's a role in McWilliams available if you're interested in interviewing for that. So, yeah, went over and interviewed for that and was successful in becoming one of the senior winemakers for McWilliams based at the Mount Pleasant site. But looking after Hunter winemaking, their New Zealand brand of portfolio. So they were doing at that time Central Otago Pinot Noir, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Gris. And then also helping out with winemaking at their mothership in Griffith as well. So it's quite a kind of varied role.
So this stage, you've handled loads of different regions, a lot of different varieties. What kind of strengths do you think you were discovering as being your core area where you could make a difference?
I became very, very operationally strong. So I think that's one of the benefits about cellar handing right through before coming into kind of winemaking, because you really sort of learn how everything happens, what the constraints are, what areas you can improve on from a quality perspective and things like that. And then also, whilst I'm not particularly savvy in vineyards, I'm a shed winemaker. I'm quite good at picking decisions and that's about it. You know, knowing what vineyards look like in terms of, okay, this is balanced. Then being able to sort of get all that in the mix as well with a lot of different vineyard experience. And I think one of the really interesting things about, say, McWilliams, for example, is you're winemaking across 5 different sites, and each of those sites has its own intricacies and things that work and things that don't work. So, when you're making Central Otago Pinot Noir at a small place in Central Otago, and then you have to work out how to get it bottled and things like that. A lot of different complexities within the winery industry you get quite good at.
So how long were you at McWilliams?
So at McWilliams from end of 2010 to end of 2013.
And from there you went to Pepper Tree, is that right?
Yeah, Pepper Tree Briar Ridge from there. So McWilliams was at the start of their great kind of shuffle in terms of what they were trying to do from a company logistics and things like that. It's not all beer and Skittles in the wine industry. I remember having a meeting where I was told that there was no job for me at Mount Pleasant. It was either I could move to Griffith and be on the senior winemaking team there with awesome people, or I could go into sales in Sydney in the head office, and those were my 2 options. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is really interesting, like that they think that would be something that I would want to do. And I remember ringing one of my other great mentors and sounding board, Sue Bell, and she sort of said to me, the only woman on the winemaking team ever at that point, she sort of said to me, she's like, well, move to Griffith and then just get yourself pregnant with an illegitimate child, and then they won't know what to do with you. All completely in jest, obviously. But it was this kind of it was probably my first real reckoning of, this isn't always going to be easy. This isn't always going to be a lighthearted, fun, let's make wine and have a great time industry. It was kind of that first moment of realising I'd gotten to a certain point where steps would perhaps sometimes become roadblocks. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, that's interesting that they don't value me enough to keep me in a place. So I said, okay, well, I'm not interested in doing either of those things. I'm not moving to Griffith as a single 30-year-old woman. I have no interest in doing that. I have no interest in being in sales in Sydney. So I applied for jobs and ended up getting the winemaking job at Bright Ridge. As they say, revenge is best served as a dish cold, and then in 2014 I took out the Hunter Valley Wine Show for Best Young Sem. I got the Gourmet Traveller Young Winemaker of the Year, and I took out the Ducks of the Awac course within that year, and I just thought, well, at least I've shown them my ability, and it probably speaks more to my personality that I needed something outward facing to say, well, screw you. But yeah, I was like, okay, well, at least I've got that. Like, at least I can step away, not wanted in one aspect, but still with some external validation.
Yeah, those sorts of roadblocks, I'm sure that they come thicker, faster, maybe earlier too, to women in the industry. I wonder as well whether that funnel's quite full of young people who can't all go somewhere. I think it kind of happens in hospitality to a degree as well, that there's plenty of fuel for the fire, but then at some point people either burn out or just don't have something else to do. Does it feel a bit like that's something that maybe you don't see coming because there are so many opportunities in big companies to begin with that then start to filter down to not many rich pickings?
Yeah, well, and I think it's, a couple of those things, there's, 5 cellar hands in a winery, and there's, 1 cellar supervisor, 1 winemaker and 1 senior winemaker kind of thing. So it does kind of thin out as you get to the top, and that makes sense as well. But I think also would be lying if I didn't say that there weren't perhaps further complexities to women entering, those higher ones as well. And also just women entering cellar hands with the rigidity of the operational running of most wineries, that makes things hard for lots of other factors in life.
Yeah. Do you see any changes in that over the last decade?
I think people have become more conscious of it. I think in bigger wineries, there's been a lot more flexibility around job sharing and around flexible work times and flexible work conditions and things like that. Like, you talk to women who work for the likes of Treasury, they work 8 hours a day. They still are able to do their other commitments outside of work if they want to. And that also goes for the men. It's not just a women-only flexibility thing. But I think in terms of perhaps smaller businesses, there's still a lot of roadblocks to that, because if you're the only 1 cellar hand, or you're being relied on for XYZ, then it's a more difficult conversation for that business to then understand that there are many different ways to skin the cat, right?
Yeah.
And there's also been a lack of, I think, desire and a lack of adequate suggestion and industry guidance on what options there could and should be for flexibility around those sort of things.
Yeah. You mentioned 2014, that year of high achievement. I kind of almost feel guilty saying this, but the first time I'd seen your name, I think, was in the Gourmet Traveller WINE Young Winemaker of the Year. How much of a game changer is that sort of thing? Especially when you've come, working very hard and really achieving, in a way, behind closed doors in that cellar hand pathway. It must be quite important for your career.
It was wonderful for me. There are a lot of mechanisms that people can get noticed. Back in those days, perhaps social media and things like that weren't as buoyant as they are now, but it was really nice to have that recognition. And it was also for me, it was one of those things that's like, wow, actually, someone knows who I am, and they've gone out on a limb to select me for this out of a myriad of really wonderful and impressive people. And it was really, really nice to have that validation of, oh yeah, okay, I'm good. And it was just a really nice sort of cinch to the end of quite a difficult 18 months.
Yep.
And fortify the trust your own gut and trust your own instinct sort of thing, and realise that, making those decisions for you are the right decisions to make, and you never know what's on the other side of that decision, which is always the trepidation. It was good.
Yeah, and speaking of those Villa Maria days and McWilliams, then going to Pepper Briar Ridge, even there you've got quite a few different regions that you're playing with. But I suppose also an opportunity to have a little bit more of a say. Did you find that Pepper Briar Ridge, that was quite fun, spreading your wings a little bit more?
Yeah, it was good. It was good. And, to have the flexibility of, really implementing different wine styles and things like that. And they have a lot of different varieties. And I think by the time I left, they were making something like 148 different individual wines across the 3 companies because, so many different varieties and so many different vineyards. And certainly the thought of jack of all trades, masters of none comes to thought. But in those early days, it was really, really interesting to really be able to sink your teeth into a lot of different things across a lot of different vineyards and have a play around and really learn a lot about different tannin manipulation in terms of, making Cabernet from Rattenbury versus making Hunter Valley Shiraz and, different expressions of Hunter Valley Semillon plus orange Chardonnay and things like that. So really able to understand what varieties do and how you can look to get the best out of them and have a lot of fun trying to change styles or push boundaries and learn to go from there.
And up to that point, what were the grape varieties / regions / vineyards that you most enjoyed working with?
I have a deep love of Chardonnay. I really enjoyed drinking it. We didn't have great Chardonnay vineyards, but the little Briar Hill coming out of Mount View for Briar Ridge is a great little block and produces some really, really stunning Chardonnay, so that was always fun to make. And then I think, Rattenbury Cabernet is quite a fascinating wine in terms of tannin expression and site expression and being able to explore nuances of different blocks in Rattenbury and that limestone effect coming into Cabernet and the tannin structure and things like that. That was really enjoyable.
How did you enjoy working out of the Hunter?
The people in the Hunter are wonderful. It's a really great, lovely community and lots of really great people up there. The seasons are challenging. There's a lot of different things that can happen. It's such a nice area and just a lot of fun, I suppose, with that gang of people and making nice wines and the collegiate activities that they do in the Hunter where it's, the annual SEM tasting and the annual Shiraz tasting and all that sort of stuff.
And so onto where you've ended up now. That job, I'm assuming, was quite fiercely force over. What were your impressions when the opportunities came up to apply for Henschke, and what was the process like that got you there?
So I'd kind of been at Pepper Briar Ridge for a number of years now and getting a bit, for lack of a better term, a bit bored there and kind of realising it was really time for me to look for somewhere else. And Adam and I had many long discussions about it. So I was on maternity leave with my second born, Margot, and I saw this senior winemaking role for Henschke being advertised. And I thought, oh, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So typed out a little application letter, CV, and sent it off and had my first interview with the team over Teams. Travel was still a bit restricted at those times. And then was very surprised when they rang me and said, would like you to come down to the winery for a face-to-face interview in the next round. And it was funny because I was sort of prepping to go down to Henschke for the interview, and Adam, my very lovely partner, looked at me and he said, have you given any thought as to whether or not you even want to live in the Barossa? looked at him, I was like, babe, I'm going as the diversity interview. Like, they're not going to hire a New South Wales-based winemaker specialising in cool climate, orange, and hunter. They're after some card-carrying, check shirt-wearing, moleskin-owning Barossa man that's been making Shiraz for the last 30 years. And he looked at me and he's like, you do know that you are the only person on this earth who would be walking into a Henschke interview thinking that, right? I was like, oh, yeah, that's a fair point. And then, you know, my next question with how my brain works is, do you think I should go as like fully me, or do you think I should maybe like tone it down a bit? Because, you know, I'd met Stephen and Prue before, but had never spent a lot of time with them, and they're such lovely, reserved, conscientious people. I was like, what should I do here? And again, Adam, the voice of reason, was like, well, if you went as half of yourself, and he's like, which, just an FYI, isn't actually possible, then would you be comfortable if they offered you the role? Or would you be constantly tying yourself in knots because you'd pretended to be half of yourself for the interview? I was like, oh, that's a really good point. Yep, okay, great, voice of reason. Yep, I've got one last question. And he's like, all right, let's hear it. And I said, do you think I should tell them I'm on maternity leave and that I'll need to express when I'm down there? I'm there the whole day, I'm not staying overnight or anything like that. And again, in his very calm voice, as he does, he looked at me and he said, do you want to work for them if that's a problem? And I said, also, very good point. So yeah, I flew down for the interview. I was the last of the final interviews. I do know that there were 5 people in the final interview stage. I remember picked up by the CEO, driven up to the winery, shown the vineyards, met the winery team, and then went into the formal interview with Stephen and Prue, and CEO, and a couple of other sort of key members. And I had to bring 2 of my wines that I've made, and I had to taste 3 Henschke wines. And I remember Stephen poured me the Nebbiolo come off the Eden Valley vineyard, and he said, oh, what do you think of that? And I said, oh, Steve, to be honest, I don't really like how the acid, tannin, alcohol framework sits in this wine. To me, the alcohol looks disjointed and out of place in relation to where the tannin and the acid are sitting. And he looked at me and he's like, well, it's 12.8% alcohol, so it's clearly not that. I went, okay, well, there goes the job. And I had a lovely time, and you know, I was just so blown away by everything Henschke in terms of the people themselves, the history, the vineyards, the winery, everything like that. So yeah, flew home, and you know, Adam sort of said, oh, how'd it go? And I said, oh, you know, totally blew it. You know, no way I'm going to be their preferred candidate. And I was standing in the backyard at 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon and had the phone call to say, you are our preferred candidate. And I just remember going, oh, okay. Now I really am going to have to decide if we want to move to the Barossa. Clearly, Adam and I decided to take the plunge.
Yeah, it's interesting that you had those thoughts about Henschke and the kind of winemaker you thought that they were after. Were you asked at all about your perception of Henschke?
That is a great question, Ed. And I actually don't remember in the blur of the interview, to be honest, being specifically asked about the perception of Henschke wines.
Or I suppose what you thought that you might bring to Henschke, whether you were there to settle into something that was already this really nicely polished machine, or whether you were there to bring either half of you or all of you to that role.
Yeah, I do remember those questions around that. And, you know, I think probably one of the difficulties for the management team was trying to work out whether people were coming to Henschke for the right reasons. You know, yes, there are great vineyards in terms of Hill of Grace and Mount Eddleston, but you know, we actually make 42 different wines. So having I think the zest and the energy for all of it was a big thing. And I remember one question was about, you know, why are you interested in this role? And I sort of said, you know, I think you get to a point in your career where it's no longer about the accolades and it's no longer about the experience and getting it on your resume. You get to a point in your career where you want to work with and for people who share the same values as you do, whether that be about, you know, the world in general or the environment or anything like that. You know, what I see of Henschke and what I see of Stephen and Prue and how they conduct themselves in quite an ethical, thoughtful, considerate manner with a very high focus on regenerative viticulture and leaving the world in a better place, not just from an agriculture point of view, but from a very holistic point of view, was really, really attractive. And I remember there was a bit of a lulled silence after I said that, and like lots of silent nodding, and I was like, I think I nailed that question. Maybe I'm clawing a bit back here. So I think there was a lot of concern from internal Henschke that people just wanted to come and make Hill of Grace, but there's so many other wonderful things that this business is about, and so many other wonderful wines that we make, and so much other rich history and important things to the family and to the business itself.
Yeah. Was it end of 2023 you started there?
End of 22, so I've actually finished 3 vintages here now.
Right. And how has that gone?
It has been both more rewarding and more challenging than I probably could have ever thought it was going to be, both from a professional sense and also a personal sense as well. 2023 was a very long, cool, wet vintage. I finished my maternity leave and we moved the family down to start the job, 9th of January. So it was our first ever vintage with 2 children. We'd moved to a place with no support. We had 2 friends, and my very lovely partner had gone from working in an office to working from home, and the first year was awful. The vintage was challenging, but after all those years in the hunter of long, cool, wet vintages, it was, totally fine. Nothing we hadn't really dealt with before, and all that sort of thing. And I think it's also one of those things where you sort of also start to realise that the role is actually a lot bigger than perhaps you had originally thought it was as well, in terms of where the business is going and things like that. So the first year was very hard, but we kind of got out of that and realised that, this is the right place for us. And kids were a lot more settled, and we bought a house and we've got our own space. And then we had vintage 2024, and it was this like beautiful, perfect, quintessential vintage of wonderful ripening and wonderful weather. And Fraser, the winemaker I work with here, and I joke constantly that we probably just should have retired after 24. Like, I'm not sure if we're going to get any better vintages after that. And then we had 2025, which was quite possibly the awful vintage, not from a quality point of view, but because of environmental factors and how compact and condensed that vintage was. So sort of seen the breadth of all of Barossa vintages in cool, long and wet for the first one, perfect for 2024, and then really hot, dry and condensed for 25. So it's been a roller coaster, but it has been intensely rewarding at the same time.
Yeah, I suppose with that, the intensely different circumstances, the fact that 23 sounds like it would have been a really bloody hard year, no matter what. But now, a few years in, do you feel comfortable with the role and a good idea about what your strengths are there at Henschke, both as a winemaker in charge, but also understanding what those resources and the potential that you have? Yeah,
absolutely. In my naivety, I originally thought that it would be just winemaking, and we have Stephen Henschke, who does a lot of winemaking himself, and then we have the Henschke family that does a lot of brand work and things like that. But once I sort of got into the role, I sort of realised that Steve's quite keen on maybe playing a bit more golf and having a bit more time to focus on the things he wants to do. I'm here to facilitate all of the winemaking so that he doesn't have to worry about that, right? And he can come in and taste things that he wants to taste and ask questions about what he wants to ask questions about, and give style direction where needed. But certainly it's a very rewarding winemaking role, because you have the ability to really understand what the family wants from their wines and to then facilitate that. Single vineyard wines express their vineyard site, so it's down to working with the vineyard team about cropping levels and canopy and things like that. And then the next level down, our legacy collection, which is Marble Angel Cabernet, Tapa Shiraz, Cape Euphonium, Johannsgarten. It's a lot more about, I think, keeping the ship tight and tidying up the house and sort of just bringing things a bit more in tune and in line. I see us needing to make a lot more bright, expressive, fruitful wines, and how we go about facilitating that, getting picking dates right, getting oak selection right, getting maturation right, getting those conditions really fine-tuned to get those wines a lot more fruit-driven and a lot more bright and fresh and all those sort of things. So there's a lot of little strings to be pulled to really get all of that together, and I think that's where we're comfortably sitting at the moment. And the other really fun thing with winemaking here is there are a number of wines we get to create, and Prue likes to plant different things and trial different things, and she's a very keen mind and a very explorative and avid learner. So she's planted a whole heap of Rhone varieties over on a block. So we've got, Grenache Gris, Clairette, Carignan, Cinsault, Grenache Noir, and then she's just grafted over Picpoul, Marsanne and Roussanne. And those weren't really going anywhere. They were just kind of going into Henry VII. And I had the idea of starting up a sequential rolling ferment to ferment all of those varieties together and make a sort of textural, medium-bodied red wine. So we sort of picked the Grenache Gris first, and that went into the concrete open. And then 3 days later, we picked the Clairette, and it eventually fermented over 3 weeks, and we've now put it into bottle, and it's come up with a name, and it's being released this year out of 2024 for the first year. And it's this really cool expression of sight where, it makes me quite proud to have taken a block that Prue planted and to create this wine that I think is uniquely expressive. Homage to Prue, this really cracking, interesting wine that I think speaks of Eden Valley and speaks of Henschke in terms of that high style with it into the concrete, but has never been done before.
Yeah, cool. Does that one have a name yet?
So it's called the Nurturer. She didn't want us to call it the Prudence or anything like that, so it became the Nurturer to allow that nice connection into Prue and what she brings with all of her extensive wisdom.
Obviously, it's not about, or at least you didn't say it was in your interview because it would have been the wrong answer, about Hill of Grace and the headlines, but at the same time, must have been pretty humbling looking at an uber vertical of that wine and thinking about the legacy that you're continuing.
Hill of Grace is a remarkable vineyard, and it's one of those vineyards that you can walk into and it feels calm and it feels well loved, and you can see why it grows grapefruit. And it's such a lovely thing to be able to then drill down into the individual blocks and the nuances that you get out of those individual blocks and how they all come together to make the wine what it is. I think one of the beautiful things about that vineyard is it also has a little bit of an undulation. It's got a creek bed, so the blocks are actually quite different. So when you're blending them all together to make this wine, they do all sort of have their own puzzle piece that fits together nicely, whether it's the fragrance perfumed or whether it's the big deep dark structure and things like that. And learning all that is quite wonderful. But the other thing I love about the Hill of Grace vineyard is it has the history, right? So, Stephen always says that it's always ripe on the moon before Easter. And in 2023, it was cold, it was wet. And to be perfectly honest, I thought that was such an amount of marketing bullshit that I did not believe that there was ever going to be possible. And I mean, it's hilarious, right? Because it just sounds exactly what it is. This young upstart winemaker being like, there's no way this vintage is going to come into that kind of thing. And then about a week before the moon before Easter, Steve's like, oh, good, I think we need to go out and have a taste of the fruit on Hill of Grace. And I was like, I was out there last week, Steve, it's ages away. He's like, no, I think we need to go out and have a taste. I was like, okay, no worries. Walked out there, I was like, oh, I see. And it ripened on the Easter moon. And 2024, again, very different vintage to 23. So 2024 was a leap year. Easter was at the end of March. There was a 4-day heat wave. 1962, also a leap year, also Easter at the end of March. According to the family almanac, there was also a heat wave. And we found out at the end of vintage, when Johan had been looking through the family almanac, that we managed to pick Hill of Grace Riesling on exactly the same calendar day in the 2 years. And we picked the grandfather's Shiraz 1 calendar day after they did in 1962. So it's all these really fascinating, wonderful things. And you have a look at 2025, very short compact season. We ended up picking it on the 3 days before the Easter moon, so a full month early, and it was 3 flower days leading into a blood moon. And they'd gone back through the almanac and realised that there were 2 other times that they picked a whole 30 days before the Easter moon, and that was in 1995 and 1965. How many years are there between 1965 and 1995?
There are 30.
And how many days in a month are there?
There are 30.
So every 30 years, the lunar calendar and the day calendar kind of does a little bit of a shift, and Hill of Grace decides it needs to be picked the month earlier.
That's really cool.
It's wacky stuff.
That is wacky stuff.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. But they are wines that are made in the vineyard. You see the grandfathers come in and it looks phenomenal being destemmed. It looks phenomenal in the fermenter. It looks wonderful as it goes to oak, So we compostral mulch. It's on a 3-year rotating cycle. We measure the yeast assimilable nitrogen, or YAN, which is the amount of nitrogen that the soil can provide into the grapes. And having high YAN basically means that you have more nutrient for the yeast to eat as it's fermenting, which theoretically means you have less demands for added nutrient or having to manipulate that fermented oil. Hill of Grace sits at about 400 to 420 parts per million yan. Some of our sort of lesser grower blocks where they're a bit more high intensity farm can come in at 70 yan. So you have all these like really intrinsic differences where it's obviously quite good growing to facilitate these wonderful wines, and that's, you know, all of the hard work that Prue and her vineyard team do, and that I think really shows in the wines that are just such wonderful expressions of their individual site, and that's a beautiful thing. I mean, that's the great thing about drinking wine, right? It's the only kind of tangible time moment of that particular year. You can drink a bottle of wine from your birth year. You can drink a bottle of wine from the year you graduated. You can drink a bottle of wine from, you know, the year you got married, the year you got divorced, the year you know, had your babies and things like that. And I think that's the fun part. And the expression of site and the expression of vintage on that site is, to me, the magic of why we make wine. And that's inherently a really fun thing to do when you work for a company that is very fortunate to have a massive museum where you can really sort of have a look at these similar vintages and really kind of see how they play out and everything like that. In 2023, when I started, it was so serendipitous to start at the anniversary of Hill of Grace, where the family was organising a vertical of Hill of Grace, you know, from 1956 right through to 2018, and to taste a number of those wines and to hear not just Stephen and Prue talk about them, but to hear other people's opinions or recollections of those vintages. And that shared storytelling, I mean, this is exactly what you do, right? Like, it's such a beautiful way to articulate stories and to share stories, and being able to see how one vineyard can show itself both differently and similarly over the course of different vintages is a fascinating thing. And I think that's where you really get the kick out of it.
Yeah, and speaking of sharing stories, I'm sure that you shared a few this past week. You've just come back from Sydney Royal.
Yes.
Good week's judging?
Great week's judging, great crew. You know, Mike Julius as chair, he's such a wonderfully inclusive human being, and he's intensely funny and very warm, and has a way of making everyone feel at ease, whether he's giving them way too much stick or you know, being quite sort of calm and offering them advice and things like that. And it's always such a great way to catch up on industry news and hear how everyone's going. And I think production-wise and operationally-wise, we're in a kind of scary point at the moment in this industry that it's not easy. It's not going to be easy. There's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of vineyards being pulled out or shut down, and there's, you know, wineries being sold or wineries being closed or wineries being amalgamated. It's going to be frightening to see what happens in the next 12 to 18 months. And, you know, those friends and those loved ones that are working in different areas of the wine industry that are currently wondering what's going to happen. It was nice to kind of catch up with people and share some stories and taste some wines and share a couple laughs and tell each other terrible jokes. And yeah, it was good.
Any particularly exciting classes that you looked at?
The Italian red varieties. So there was some cracking Sangiovese, some cracking Nebbiolos on the table. Really lovely to see nice vintages of Shiraz being 22, 23. Cabernet looks wonderful. We have continued to get better as an industry, and there aren't too many terrible wines on the tables these days, and aren't too many obvious and inherently faulty wines and things like that. So yeah, it was great. But having a look at, you know, wonderful Sangiovese and wonderful Nebbiolo, and going to really have a look at that schedule of results, and they come out and find out who those producers are and really have a look at them.
Yeah, I'll be keeping a keen lookout. And on that subject of having laughs and conversations, tell me a little bit more about Adam and you. Who chooses the wine and what you what you two like to drink together?
Yes, so my very lovely other half is a wine buyer, so he's tasked with most of the wine buying for the household. We do a bit of a sort of weekend sommelier roster and weekend wine options roster, so as to who's choosing sort of thing, which is a bit of fun. We have two young, small children, so we actually don't drink Monday to Friday because we were finding it just was not conducive to health and well-being, either physical or mental. So we just drink Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, and we drink well. So whether that's looking at a new producer or wine that we've found from a friend that's made it in McLaren Vale, or Adam's found someone through work, or whether we're drinking something that, you know, one of us has bought. We try to drink better, seeing as we're not drinking often. Wine is one of those emotive things where sometimes you just don't feel like what you've opened. so you have to kind of find it. Adam's annoyingly very good at options, and because he knows all of the wine in our house, if I really want to get him on options, I often have to buy it when I'm off on a sales trip and then present it to him blind. Although I did get him a good one the other day when I served him a Hunter Valley wine, so that was good. We do drink and actively talk about wine and try to challenge each other there. I think that's a great thing about having a technical palate versus what we perhaps call the style palate. And, the discussions you can have on, is that Brettanomyces or is that sweetness, and is that a problem? And, is that level of VA acceptable, and things like that. And he reminds me to perhaps forgive things sometimes, that, the beauty is not imperfection. The beauty is in a wine that is intrinsically itself and whether it showcases itself to that point. So, yeah, we've been drinking a little bit of Italian. We've been trying to actively drink more South Australian wine at the moment, just with obviously making it and trying to understand Barossa Valley versus Eden Valley and, Old Vine Barossa Valley. So whether we're looking at, the Western Ridge or, what we do up in Eden Valley and things like that, to really kind of drill down and be total wine nerds together and drink some nice wine.
Very cool. And last question, you mentioned how you had become operationally competent or perhaps excellent quite early on, and now in charge of a team in a very well set, very well respected winery. What are those things that you kind of hope to bring when you're showing the full Gwyn Olsen, personality-wise, judgment-wise, taste-wise, I suppose? What are those things that you hope that you're able to communicate and leave people with when you're in a room full of people and able to enjoy the privilege of tasting or showing wine?
Oh, that's a good question, Ed. I think there's such a wonderful, rich tapestry to all wine, and I'm not particularly good at always describing wine, but I hope that when I am in the room sharing wine and sharing stories, that people are at least having a wonderful, warm, generous experience. And whether that is through knowledge shared or through simple acts of stories and conviviality, I just hope that I leave people feeling warm and included and seen and enjoying that moment, because I think so many times some of that can get missed. I think, if you're not having a great time drinking wine, then what's the point? And if you're not having a great time showing people wine, then what's the point? And there are so many other things to worry about and so many other things to stress about. But, a warm, shared enjoyment of what is a wonderful thing to create is, I think, where the magic happens. And that's the whole aim.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, share, give it a rating. It helps enormously to get the word out. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, and to my guest, Gwyn Olsen. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.